With us, Chief China Economist at Morgan Stanley, here with us to help us unpack the CPI print. The copper price is interesting because it's down to being priced in dollars. But initial take on the inflation, the lack of inflation.
So Ming did a great summary. There is no signs of decisive reflation. If you look at the CPI, over the last 3-4 months, they edged up, largely due to gold price and vegetables. If you strip that out, anything in the core services remained very weak due to insufficient domestic demand. PPI improved a little bit, but I think it's just mechanical. If you look at the PPIs due to commodity price, it's all contributed by global factors. It's not a demand-led turn in China because we see no pass-through from this upstream commodity price to downstream or consumer goods. So there is no decisive reflation yet in China.
I'm wondering, when you talk about PPI, actually, if you pull out and look at the longer term, it's steadily been improving since maybe middle of last year. And some economists think we could see positive PPI somewhere maybe middle of this year. Do you think that's possible?
Well, if you think about the big picture, China need to reflate. They need to do 3 steps. Step 1, don't add new capacity in these oversupplied sectors. They started to do that anti-involution. Step 2, cutting excess capacity. They haven't done much. There is very limited progress on that front due to job concerns or debt concerns. Finally, boost consumption, particularly boosting it in a sustainable way, not just cash for clunkers subsidy, but try to provide a better upgraded social safety net to unlock consumption. That part is also quite weak, right? So that's why I don't see sustained reflation here. And the PPI improvement you mentioned, I mentioned is mechanical because global factors like dollar debase or global AI data center demand, that's helping the upstream price going up. But we don't see it's passing through to any of the downstream or consumer price in China. That showed it's largely imported due to external factors. It's not a China-led reflation.
So the lack of, let's just call it demand pull inflationary pressures. That's really what matters, right? And that's really what keeps the thing sustainable. That's the backdrop. I'll bring in 2 other stories recently. There's the conversation around VAT and the stronger currency. Both of those things are counter inflation. The other one, actually, if you add inflation, it's not perhaps the best time to do that. Where do you think those 2 stories fit into the inflation picture?
Well, the VAT debate is an interesting story. Your colleagues did a great coverage on that. That day, when they moved on the telecom VAT, from 6% rate to 9%,
right.
A lot of investors were concerned that this could become a broad-based VAT hikes, not just this left pocket, right pocket in a SOE-dominated telecom business, but also maybe reaching out, going after private firms in internet platforms, e-commerce, gaming on VAT hikes. We don't think they will do that because it's counterproductive. It's bad for reflation, it's hurting confidence, and it's inconsistent with the macro consistency review framework. But investors are concerned due to legitimate reasons. We think in the upcoming National People's Congress in March, they may set the fiscal deficit ratio at the same level of last year. So if the economy is in deflation, you actually need more proactive fiscal policy, expanding fiscal deficit, be it the headline deficit or the broad augmented deficit. If you keep it stable, because government revenue is going to underperform during deflation, revenue as percentage of GDP may decline.
Right.
And the deficit keeps stable, that means spending power to support the economy, support consumption, will be limited, right? So investors have a point. Maybe the government need to collect more revenue by hiking some tax rates, but that's counterproductive during deflation. So that's why I think if they keep a modest, stable deficit ratio, it's probably not decisive reflation efforts. But I do think if first half growth under-delivered, they may do a top-up in this fiscal package by second half of this year, in the order of maybe 0.5% of GDP, less than 1 trillion RMB, targeting consumption or housing support.
To your point about fiscal policies, right, I think so far all the signs this year showed that the government is pulling back significantly in terms of consumption subsidies. Last year is 300 billion yuan. This year is 60 over billion yuan. And you mentioned the social safety net as well. What do you think is holding the government back from decisively pumping in more fiscal policies here?
I think old habits die hard, right? They try to be restrained on how much debt they want to raise, how much deficit they want to expand, partially due to the concerns if you do too much debt expansion, it's bad for the future. But also how you spend the debt. China was used to the supply-centric business model, spending it on infrastructure capex or manufacturing upgrade. But we know in some areas it's already oversupplied, infrastructure or industrial capacity, so they have to shift the pattern of the spending mix from investing in physical goods to investing in human capital, like social welfare. But these are all multi-year journey of reform. I don't expect that they can do a big bang reform this year. It may be the start of the next 5-year plan, emphasizing the upgrading of a social safety net, but it will take some time. So to your question, fiscal policy is still restrained because there are still a lot of old habits, and old habits die hard.
Some of the old, let's call it old habits, to borrow the concept you just raised there, is an exercise in setting GDP and growth targets, right? And we've heard from many provinces recently over their individual targets for 2026. How do those targets inform you over what the aggregate economic growth target is going to be at the NPC and what they'll tell us then?
Yeah, we closely monitor how these local NPC from each province or cities are tracking on GDP target. Most of them trimmed the target. So on average, they lowered the target of last year's 5.5% to 2026 5%, around 5%. So that probably showed national target will also be around 5%. I don't think it's a downgrade. It's more like becoming more practical. If they can tolerate slightly slower growth, instead of doing all in for capex to reach that 5% or above growth target, this tolerance of slightly slower growth is actually good for quality rebalancing efforts, because if they need to shift the spending from supply side to consumer welfare, that will take time, and in very near term, that may mean you have to tolerate a slower GDP target because it's always easier to anchor growth with infrastructure capex, while it may take longer, harder to change people's behavior on consumption. So I do take, 10 out of these top 15 provinces lower the GDP target. That's probably a good sign. They are becoming more practical. Yeah.
We have seen with the dollar slide, right, the yuan has been pushing towards 6.9, and there has been expectation that this momentum would continue throughout the year. But at the same time, this would worsen deflation, right? So how much do you think the PBOC would allow the yuan to continue strengthening?
If you ask 10 economists on their forecast of renminbi today, I think 10 out of 10 will be bullish. I am not one of them. The reason is China is in deflation, and a stronger currency in a sustainable fashion is counterproductive for reflation. It could make the PPI deflation even worse, squeezing profit margins for firms. So it's against the reflation goal. Of course, now people are looking at near term, renminbi has been strengthening. That's not a renminbi story. That's largely a dollar story. I just look at your screen, dollar index is continuing to weakening, and that's a dollar beta story. Right. It's not a renminbi alpha story. In fact, the PBOC probably prefer by maintaining the renminbi against its basket at a stable level. The safest basket will largely park at that around 100 yuan. That's the stability they are looking for. When dollar is strengthening, renminbi will weaken against the dollar. When dollar is weakening, just like now, renminbi will strengthen, but it's not a renminbi alpha story, because they know that when they have domestic deflation problem, if you have a sustainable appreciation of the currency, it's actually making PPI deflation worse, making profit margins of corporate worse. So I don't think they are looking for a stronger, sustainable appreciation of the yuan. No.
Do you think that's going to be the story of 2026, that the economy is not bad enough to merit short-term stimulus, stick to the structural story, but not good enough that it's not going to fuel this earnings rally that most equity strategists are now tying to a sustained rebound in the equity market?
Well, yes.
Goldilocks economy.
I think the theme for 26 will be similar to 25.
Okay.
It's micro positives, macro challenging. So it's a slow burn in China's gradual long-term reflation process. Macro is still challenging, particularly these macro-sensitive sectors, housing, consumption. But micro, you can see a lot of positives on tech, AI supply chain, biotech, advanced manufacturing. So this is definitely the area investors I met have been re-engaging with China. It's more on these micro positives, but on macro, people are still cautious.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, that's the name of the book, actually. Micro Fixes, Macro Slow Burn.
Right.
The report specifically, out of Morgan Stanley there. Robin Ching, fantastic. Thank you so much, sir. Chief China economist there at Morgan Stanley, and of course, China correspondent here, just with us as well, Min Lo. Right, just ahead, President Trump shrugging off the point we just made there. A weaker dollar, China is seizing the moment, touting its own strong yuan message. More on that next. This is Bloomberg.